In the year 1844, New Orleans breathed like a living creature, slow, humid, and heavy with secrets. The Mississippi River curved around the city like a dark ribbon, carrying ships loaded with cotton, sugar, and human suffering. By day, sunlight spilled over wrought iron balconies and pastel-colored homes, giving the illusion of romance and charm. By night, shadows stretched long across cobblestone streets, and the city revealed its true nature. A place where beauty was built on pain and silence was enforced by fear. The air always smelled of something mixed and uneasy: river water, sweat, magnolia blossoms, and decay. Music drifted from taverns, laughter from open windows, but beneath every sound was another noise few dared to acknowledge: the quiet despair of thousands of enslaved souls. They moved through the city like ghosts, visible yet unseen, heard yet never listened to. Their lives were measured not in dreams, but in labor, punishment, and obedience. Among them was a young woman named Eliza. She rose before dawn each morning, long before the household stirred. Her bare feet touched the cold wooden floor as she dressed in simple, worn fabric that never truly belonged to her. The mirror in her small quarters showed a reflection she had learned not to linger on: soft brown skin, tired eyes, and hair always tied back neatly, not for beauty, but for survival. Beauty, she had learned, could be dangerous. Eliza belonged to the Beaufort household, one of the most respected Creole families in New Orleans. Their mansion stood proudly near the river, its white columns polished and its iron gates tall and unforgiving. From the outside, it looked like a palace. Inside, it was a cage. Eliza worked within its walls, close enough to touch silk gowns and silver trays, yet forever forbidden from the comfort they represented. She carried trays through long hallways where portraits of dead ancestors watched her with painted eyes. She scrubbed floors that would never be hers and listened quietly as conversations about politics, money, and power floated above her head as if she were invisible. That invisibility was her shield. The less she was noticed, the safer she remained. But safety was never guaranteed. The laws of the city were written clearly, yet followed selectively. An enslaved woman had no protection, no rights, and no voice. Her body, her labor, even her future belonged to someone else. Eliza knew this truth not from books, but from scars, some visible, others buried deep within her memory. She had watched children taken from their mothers and men beaten for looking the wrong way. She had learned when to lower her eyes, when to speak, and when silence was the only way to stay alive. Still, something inside her refused to die. Sometimes, as she stood on the balcony late at night after the household had gone to sleep, she would look out over the city. Lanterns flickered in the distance and the river shimmered under the moonlight. In those moments, she imagined a different life, one where her name belonged to her alone, where her future was not decided by another's pen or temper. She did not dare speak these thoughts aloud. Hope, she had learned, was a dangerous thing. The Beaufort household ran on routine. Madame Beaufort ruled the home with a composed smile and an iron will. Her voice was soft, but her expectations were merciless. Every servant knew that one mistake could change their fate forever. Eliza had been in the house long enough to understand the unspoken rules. She moved carefully, spoke politely, and never drew attention to herself. Yet even within her quiet obedience, she observed everything. She noticed the way Madame Beaufort's mood shifted depending on the letters she received. She noticed which guests were welcomed warmly and which arrived through the back door under cover of darkness. She noticed secrets because secrecy surrounded her like a second skin. The enslaved were always watching, always listening, because knowing too much could kill you, but knowing nothing was even more dangerous. Eliza's nights were often restless. The sounds of the city crept through the walls. The distant cries from the docks, the echo of laughter from taverns, the occasional crack of a whip carried on the wind. Each sound reminded her that freedom was close enough to see, yet far enough to be impossible. She remembered her mother, who had once whispered stories of ancestors who walked freely, who loved openly, who owned their own lives. Those stories had felt like dreams even then. Her mother was gone now, sold south years earlier, her fate unknown. That loss carved a hollow place in Eliza's chest that never healed. And yet, despite everything, she carried a secret deep within her heart. It was not written on her face or spoken in her words, but it lived in the way her breath caught when she heard certain footsteps outside the gates. It lived in the way her eyes lingered just a second longer toward the market street whenever she was sent out on errands. It lived in the quiet strength that had begun to replace her fear. Eliza was in love. She did not yet fully understand how dangerous that was. In a world that denied her humanity, love was rebellion. To love was to believe she deserved happiness, and that belief alone could cost her everything. Still, she held on to it like a fragile flame, shielding it from the wind with trembling hands. The city of New Orleans had seen countless tragedies by 1844. It had swallowed stories whole and buried them beneath festivals, music and history written by powerful men. It did not care for the tears of the enslaved or the promises whispered in the dark. It thrived on contradiction, celebrating life while profiting from suffering. And as Eliza walked its streets and hallways, carrying silver trays and unspoken dreams, the city watched her quietly, waiting, because in New Orleans, secrets never stayed hidden forever. Eliza first noticed Julien in a place where enslaved people were allowed to exist briefly as humans, the market. The air there was always thick with voices, bargaining, laughter, and desperation tangled together. Vendors shouted prices, horses stamped their hooves, and baskets overflowed with vegetables, fish, and spices. For a few hours, the city loosened its grip just enough for people like Eliza to breathe a little more freely. Julien stood apart from the noise, measuring wooden planks at a carpenter's stall near the docks. He moved with purpose, his posture straight, his hands steady and skilled. There was something different about him that Eliza sensed before she fully understood it. He was not watched the way she was. No one barked orders at him. No one demanded proof of obedience. He was a free man of color, a rare and fragile status in New Orleans, earned through inheritance, purchase, or luck. Their eyes met only for a moment, but that moment lingered longer than it should have. Eliza quickly lowered her gaze, her heart pounding. She had learned early that eye contact could be misread as defiance. Yet when she dared to look again, Julien was still watching her, not with ownership or hunger, but with recognition, as if he saw her as more than property. That look haunted her for days. Their next meeting came by chance, or perhaps by fate. Eliza had been sent to deliver fabric to a nearby tailor, her steps carefully measured, her basket balanced on her arm. Julien was the ritu, repairing a broken doorframe. When the tailor stepped away, silence filled the small space. Eliza felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. "It's hot today," Julien said quietly, his voice calm, respectful. She nodded, unsure if she was even allowed to respond. Enslaved women learned to speak only when spoken to, and even then, cautiously. But something in his tone felt safe. "Yes," she replied, barely above a whisper. That single exchange became the beginning of something dangerous. After that, they found ways to see each other. Never planned, always cautious. A glance across the market, a brief word when no one was listening. Julien never touched her, never crossed a line that might bring her harm. He knew the laws better than most, and he understood how quickly love could become a death sentence. Yet feelings do not obey laws. Eliza found herself waiting for those small moments, shaping her days around them. The world inside the Beaufort mansion remained harsh and unforgiving, but outside, even for seconds, she felt seen. Julien spoke to her as if her thoughts mattered. He asked about her life, her memories, her dreams. At first, she did not know how to answer. No one had ever asked her such things before. Slowly, she began to remember who she had been before survival took over. Julien told her about his work, about saving money, about the strange balance of freedom he lived under. He could walk the streets without permission, yet he was always one accusation away from ruin. Freedom for a man of color was not safety. It was a narrow bridge over a deep abyss. Their conversations grew deeper, more intimate, though always wrapped in caution. They spoke in half sentences, coded words, and long silences filled with meaning. Love grew not through touch, but through understanding. Each meeting felt like stealing something precious from a world debt, mind to deny them joy. Eliza knew the risk. If discovered, she could be sold farther south, torn from the city she knew and sent to plantations, where survival was even less likely. Julien could be jailed, beaten, or accused of crimes he did not commit. Yet the danger made their bond stronger. Loving him was the only thing that made her feel alive. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the river in gold, Julien spoke the words she had never dared imagine hearing. "I want to buy your freedom." Her breath caught. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Freedom was a word she had learned not to hope for, not to believe in. It was a dream that often led to heartbreak. She had seen others crushed by promises that could never be fulfilled. "I'm saving," he continued softly, "every coin. I know it won't be easy. I know your owners may refuse, but I will try." Tears filled her eyes, though she tried to hide them. No one had ever spoken of her future as something worth fighting for. The idea that someone would sacrifice for her, risk everything for her, felt unreal. They began to plan in whispers. If freedom could be secured, they would leave New Orleans, the North perhaps, or even farther, somewhere the laws did not chase them at every step, somewhere love did not require secrecy. But hope has a way of changing people. Eliza began to walk differently, her shoulders slightly straighter, her steps lighter. She smiled without realizing it. And those changes did not go unnoticed. In a house where enslaved people were expected to be hollow, hope was suspicious. Madame Beaufort noticed first. She had spent her life reading people, manipulating appearances, and protecting her own secrets. She noticed Eliza's brightness, the way her eyes no longer looked empty. To Madame Beaufort, that change was a threat. She began to watch Eliza more closely. Eliza felt it. A shift in the air, the unspoken tension. Fear crept back into her heart, battling with love. She warned Julien to be careful, to stay away for a while. He agreed, though the distance hurt them both. Days passed without seeing him. Each one felt heavier than the last. Eliza replayed their conversations in her mind, holding on to his voice like a lifeline. She prayed silently, not for forgiveness, but for time. Then one evening, Julien did not appear where he usually worked. The next day, he was not at the docks. By the third day, whispers began to circulate of a man taken in the night, of violence hidden beneath official silence. Eliza's hope began to crack. She waited, listening for news, searching faces in the crowd. Each passing hour deepened her dread. Love had given her strength, but now it also gave her pain sharper than anything she had known before. In New Orleans, love between a slave and a free man was not just forbidden. It was an act of defiance against an entire system. And systems, she would soon learn, always strike back. The city, which had watched their love grow in silence, was ready to claim its price. Suspicion did not arrive loudly. It crept in the way humidity crept through the walls of the Beaufort mansion, slow, invisible, and suffocating. Madame Beaufort had ruled her household for decades with the precision of a general and the charm of a woman who knew how to make cruelty appear elegant. She prided herself on control. Every servant, every guest, every whisper inside her walls moved according to her expectations. When something shifted, she felt it long before she could name it. Eliza's change unsettled her. It was not something obvious. Eliza still rose before dawn, still moved quietly through the halls, still obeyed every command without hesitation. Yet there was a difference in her presence, a faint light behind her eyes that had not been there before. Madame Beaufort noticed it when Eliza poured her tea, when she passed through the drawing room, when she stood silently near the door during conversations meant to exclude her. The girl no longer seemed hollow. To Madame Beaufort, that was dangerous. She began to test Eliza with small cruelties, a sharp word here, an impossible task there. She watched carefully to see how Eliza reacted. Fear she could tolerate, defiance she could crush. But Eliza did neither. She absorbed every insult with quiet grace, her face composed, her voice steady. That calm unsettled Madame Beaufort more than rebellion ever could. The mistress began asking questions, not directly, but through others. She questioned house servants, dock workers, market vendors. She listened more than she spoke. Madame Beaufort had learned long ago that people revealed more when they believed they were speaking freely. Rumors began to form like storm clouds on the horizon. A free man of color, lingering glances, market encounters. Nothing concrete, but enough to confirm her instincts. Eliza, she decided, was keeping a secret, and secrets were liabilities. Madame Beaufort had her own to protect. Her carefully constructed reputation hid a life far more complicated than society allowed. The judge who visited after dark did not enter through the front door. The letters burned in the fireplace were never spoken of. The city forgave many sins, but only for those with power. A single scandal could destroy everything she had built. An enslaved girl who saw too much, who loved too boldly, was not just a servant, she was a threat. The moment Madame Beaufort became certain, she did not act in anger. She acted with calculation. That same week, Julien felt eyes on him. It began with small things. A stranger lingering near his workshop, a question asked by a man pretending to admire his work, a war, ning from a fellow carpenter who had learned when to stay quiet. Julien had lived free his entire life, but freedom had taught him caution. He knew the city's rules even when they were unspoken. He knew that men like him survived by remaining unremarkable. But love had made him visible. He stopped visiting the market. He changed his routes. He stayed close to other workers. Still, the feeling followed him, the sense of being watched, measured, judged. He thought of Eliza constantly, worried that his presence might bring danger to her doorstep. He considered leaving the city early, securing money elsewhere, returning only when he could offer her safety. He never got the chance. The night Julien disappeared, the river was loud. Rain fell in heavy sheets, masking footsteps and swallowing sound. New Orleans had always been skilled at hiding violence beneath noise and celebration. That night, it hid a crime beneath thunder. Witnesses later spoke in fragments. A struggle near the docks, a carriage moving without lanterns, voices that stopped suddenly. No one intervened, no one ever did. In New Orleans, survival depended on knowing when to look away. By morning, Julien was gone. Eliza felt it before she heard it, a tightening in her chest, a sense of dread that refused to loosen its grip. When she was sent to the market that day, her eyes searched desperately for him. His stall was empty, his tools untouched. The air felt wrong, she asked quietly, cautiously. No one answered directly. Some shrugged, others avoided her gaze. A few whispered that he had left town. That explanation did not fit. Julien would never leave without a word. He would never abandon hope without a fight. Days passed, then weeks. Eliza's fear turned into desperation. She replayed every moment, every glance, every word, wondering where they had gone wrong. She tried to remain invisible, knowing grief itself could be dangerous. Enslaved people were not allowed to mourn freely. Sorrow was seen as disobedience, as weakness. Madame Beaufort watched her closely. One evening, Eliza was summoned to the study, a room she rarely entered. The walls were lined with books she was forbidden to touch, knowledge she was forbidden to claim. Madame Beaufort sat behind her desk, composed and calm. "You've been distracted," she said lightly. Eliza lowered her eyes. "Yes, madame. Is there something you wish to tell me?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Eliza understood then that the game was already lost. Denial would not save her. Truth would destroy her. Silence was her only weapon. "No, madame," Madame Beaufort smiled. It did not reach her eyes. "Very well," she said. "You may go," but Eliza knew the danger had only begun. That night, Eliza was locked into her quarters earlier than usual. The door did not open in the morning. Instead, two men arrived, strangers with hard faces and official papers. Eliza was told to gather her things. She was not told where she was going. Fear flooded her. Being sold south was a death sentence in slow motion. She begged silently, knowing words would only make it worse. As she stepped into the hallway, she saw Madame Beaufort watching from the shadows, her expression unreadable. Then Eliza understood. Julien had not simply disappeared. He had been erased. The truth emerged in pieces, as most truths do in places built on lies. Julien had been accused of theft, a convenient charge impossible to disprove. He had been taken under cover of night, beaten until his protest turned into silence. Official records would later list him as having fled the city. The system protected itself flawlessly. Eliza never reached the auction block. Instead, she vanished. The carriage that took her did not travel south, it traveled toward the river, toward a property no longer officially in use. What happened next was never written down. It did not need to be. The city understood these endings without documentation. Weeks later, Madame Beaufort resumed her life as if nothing had changed. The judge continued to visit. The household ran smoothly. Eliza's name was never spoken again. But something lingered. Workers whispered of cries heard near the river. Fishermen claimed they saw a woman wandering at night barefoot, calling her name. The wind carried away. Some said she was mad. Others said she was dead. In New Orleans, the line between the two was often thin. Madame Beaufort died years later, wealthy and respected. The judge received a state funeral. Their secrets were buried with them, protected by silence and stone. But betrayal leaves a mark. The city remembered, even when its leaders pretended not to. The river remembered. And somewhere beneath the elegance and music of New Orleans, two lives destroyed by fear and power refused to be forgotten. Years passed, and New Orleans continued to reinvent itself the way it always had. Through celebration, through forgetting, through layering new stories over old wounds. Streets were renamed, buildings repainted, families rose and fell in influence. Yet beneath the city's polished surface, the past did not rest quietly. It waited. People spoke of Eliza and Julien less openly as time went on, but the story never truly vanished. It survived in fragments, half-remembered whispers exchanged between dock workers, market women, and elderly servants who had learned when to speak softly. No one could agree on the details, only on the feeling the story left behind, a deep unease as though something unfinished still lingered in the humid air. Children grew up hearing warnings disguised as ghost tales. Do not wander near the river at night. Do not follow singing you cannot see. Do not trust silence in a city built on secrets. The story shifted with each telling, shaped by fear and imagination, yet always returning to the same truth. Two people had loved each other in a world that refused to allow it, and the city had punished them for daring. The Beaufort estate stood unchanged for many years, its white columns still gleaming in the sun, its iron gates still locked tight. From the outside, it remained a symbol of old New Orleans elegance. Inside, however, something felt wrong. New servants rarely stayed long. Some complained of cold drafts where no windows were open. Others swore they heard footsteps in empty hallways late at night, slow and deliberate, as if someone were pacing with purpose. The family dismissed such claims as imagination. Superstition was common among the lower classes, they said. Yet even the Beauforts avoided certain rooms after dark. Even they felt it, the quiet pressure of something unseen, something unresolved. Decades later, the estate changed hands. By then, slavery had ended, at least on paper. The city was learning to speak new words: freedom, reconstruction, justice, though it struggled to understand their meaning. The Beaufort mansion, once filled with rigid order, was sold to developers eager to modernize the property. Walls were to be knocked down, floors replaced, hidden spaces exposed to daylight for the first time. Work began in the heat of summer. Laborers quickly discovered that the house had been built with more than elegance in mind. False walls hid narrow passages, doors led to nowhere. Beneath the main structure lay a cellar not marked on any official plans. Its entrance had been sealed so carefully it appeared intentional, not accidental. When they finally broke through, the air that rushed out was stale and heavy, as if it had been trapped for generations. The cellar was small and windowless, its stone walls damp and stained. At first, the workers thought it had been used for storage. Then they saw the bones. Two skeletons lay close together on the cold ground, not scattered, not careless. They were positioned as if placed deliberately, side by side, hands intertwined. Time had stripped them of flesh and identity, but some details remained. A rusted carpenter's ring still clung to one skeletal finger. Around the other wrist lay the fragile remains of a woven cloth bracelet, handmade, delicate, unmistakably personal. The room fell silent. Authorities were called, and the discovery sparked brief excitement in the local papers. Speculation ran wild. Murder, disease, forgotten servants. Officials examined the remains quickly, too quickly. No names were assigned. No in-depth investigation followed. The case was closed with vague explanations and minimal documentation. But the city knew better. Old dock workers recognized the ring style immediately. Elderly women wept when they heard where the bones had been found. Stories long buried resurfaced with renewed clarity. Eliza, Julien. The names passed from mouth to mouth like a shared confession. For many, the discovery confirmed what they had always suspected, that the lovers had not fled, had not been sold separately, had not simply disappeared. They had been silenced together, hidden away to protect reputations and preserve power. Their love had been considered dangerous enough to erase, but not dangerous enough to mourn. After the remains were removed, the cellar was sealed again. The estate was renovated, transformed into apartments, then later into a cultural landmark celebrating New Orleans history. Visitors walked its halls admiring architecture, unaware of what lay beneath their feet, or perhaps they sensed it. People reported strange experiences almost immediately. Lights flickered in, rooms that had been rewired. Soft singing echoed through corridors late at night, sometimes in French, sometimes in Creole, always mournful. Couples argued inexplicably in certain rooms, overwhelmed by sadness they could not explain. Others felt an intense warmth, a strange comfort, as though someone unseen was standing beside them. Tour guides began including the story in whispered tones, framing it as legend rather than truth. It was safer that way. Legends could be dismissed. History could not. At night, especially near the river, people claimed to see two figures walking side by side. A woman in plain clothing, barefoot, her posture gentle yet unbroken. A man beside her, tall and steady, as if guarding her from a world that had already failed them once. They never spoke to the living. They never caused harm. They simply walked, disappearing when approached too closely. Some believed the spirits were trapped, bound to the place of their suffering. Others believed they stayed by choice, unwilling to leave the city that had stolen so much from them, yet still carried their memory. For many, the idea that love could survive such cruelty, even in death, was comforting. Historians debated the story's accuracy. Without records, they argued, nothing could be proven. But the absence of records was itself proof. In 1844, silence was the most powerful tool of all. What was not written could not challenge those in control, and yet the truth had surfaced anyway. The mystery surrounding Eliza and Julien became part of New Orleans' identity, a reminder of the countless lives shaped, broken, and erased by slavery. Their story stood for all the stories never told, all the names never recorded, all the loves denied the chance to exist openly. The city continued to celebrate, to sing, to dance. Tourists filled the streets, marveling at its charm, its resilience, its soul. Few realized that the soul of New Orleans had been forged as much by tragedy as by joy. Eliza and Julien were no longer just ghosts in a hidden cellar. They were a symbol of defiance, of humanity, of love that refused to obey unjust laws. Though history had tried to bury them, the city itself had brought them back into the light. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved completely. They exist to remind us of what happens when power fears love, when systems punish hope, and when silence is mistaken for peace. In New Orleans, the past never truly dies. It walks beside the present, waiting to be remembered. Time has a strange way of honoring what history tries to erase. Long after names fade from documents and faces disappear from portraits, feelings remain. Grief, longing, love, woven into the very places where they were born. In New Orleans, this truth lives quietly but persistently, breathing through old streets, drifting across the river at dusk, and whispering through the walls of buildings that have seen too much. Eliza and Julien became more than a mystery. They became a presence. Those who grew up in the city learned early that New Orleans was not just a place. It was a memory that refused to forget itself. Every generation inherited stories that were never fully written down, stories passed along in tones meant to warn rather than explain. Eliza and Julien's tale settled into that tradition, told not as fact alone, but as feeling. You could sense it when walking near the river at night, when the music faded and the air grew heavy, when the city seemed to pause and listen to itself. People who claimed to see them never described fear. Instead, they spoke of sadness mixed with peace. The woman was always described as calm, her movements slow and gentle, as if she no longer carried the weight she once bore in life. The man walked beside her, steady and protective, his presence quiet but unwavering. They did not wander aimlessly. They walked with purpose, as though retracing paths they had once dreamed of walking freely together. Some said the spirits were bound by injustice, unable to leave until the truth was fully acknowledged. Others believed they stayed because New Orleans, for all its cruelty, had also been the place where they found love. Even in suffering, it had given them something precious: connection, recognition, a shared dream of freedom. Perhaps that was enough to anchor them there. Over time, their story began to change those who heard it. Young lovers listened differently after hearing of Eliza and Julien. They held each other a little tighter, more aware of the privilege of loving openly. Descendants of enslaved families felt a deep ache, but also a strange comfort, knowing that their ancestors had loved fiercely even when the world denied their humanity. Historians began revisiting old records, reading between the lines, searching for the lives hidden in omissions and destroyed documents. Eliza and Julien reminded the city that slavery was not only a system of forced labor, it was a system designed to crush intimacy, to control affection, to deny the enslaved even the most basic human right to choose whom they loved. Their romance stood as quiet rebellion against that cruelty. They had dared to imagine a future together, and for that, the system had destroyed them. But destruction was not the end of their story. In death, they became inseparable in a way the law had never allowed in life. Where chains had once defined Eliza's existence, memory now set her free. Where Julien's freedom had always been conditional, love made it absolute. The city that had once conspired to silence them now carried their voices forward, even if only in whispers. New Orleans learned something from them, even if it did not always admit it. It learned that beauty built on suffering always cracks eventually. It learned that secrets rot beneath elegance. And it learned that love, once born, cannot be fully controlled. Not by laws, not by power, not by time. Visitors still come to the city seeking music, celebration, and mystery. Many walk the French Quarter unaware of the layers beneath their feet. But some feel it. The quiet shift in the air, the sense that they are not alone in certain places. Those are the ones who stop, who listen, who feel something stir inside them without knowing why. Perhaps that is Eliza and Julien's final gift. They remind us that history is not only written by those who win, it also lives in the hearts of those who remember. Every act of love denied, every voice silenced, every life reduced to property leaves an echo. And sometimes those echoes become stories powerful enough to outlive the people who tried to erase them. Their tragedy was never officially recorded as it deserved to be. There were no trials, no justice, no public mourning, yet their love achieved something rare. It survived. It crossed generations, crossed silence, crossed death itself. It became part of the soul of a city famous for refusing to let the past rest quietly. In the end, Eliza and Julien are not just figures from a tragic slave-era romance. They are symbols of resilience, of humanity under oppression, of love that chose to exist, even when the cost was unbearable. Their story asks us to remember the countless others whose names were lost, whose stories were never told, whose love never had a chance to be seen. And as long as New Orleans stands, singing, mourning, celebrating, remembering, their story will remain, because some love stories do not end. They simply change form. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more powerful and meaningful stories. Take care of yourself and those you love. Thanks for being here.